Good morning, crime community. I'm here to read out another story by Edgar Allan Poe. It's called The Colloquy of Manos and Una. Una, born again? Manos, yes, fairest and best beloved Una, born again? These were the words upon those mystical meanings I had so long pondered, rejecting the explanation of the priesthood, until death himself resolved for me the secret. Una, death. Manos, how strangely sweet Una. You echo my words. I observe too the vacillation in your step, a joyous inquietude in your eyes. You are confused and oppressed by the majestic novel of the eternal life. Yes, it was death I spoke, and how singularly sounds the word which of old was wont to bring terror to all hearts, throwing a mildew upon all pleasures. Una, ah, death, the spectre which sat at all feasts. How often, Manos, did we lose ourselves in speculation upon its nature? How mysteriously did it act as a cheek to human bliss, saying unto it, thus far and no further. The earnest mutual love of my own Manos, which burned within our bosoms, how vainly did we flatter ourselves, feeling happy in its upspringing, that our happiness would strengthen with its strength. Alas, as it grew, so grew to our hearts that dread of that evil hour which was hurrying to separate us forever. This in time it became painful to love. Hate would have been mercy then. Mano, speak not here of the griefs, dear Una, mine forever now. Una, but the memory of past sorrow, is it present joy? I have much to say yet of the things which have been, and above all, I burn to know the incidents of your own passage through the dark valley of shadow. Manos, and when did the radiant Una ask anything of her Manos in vain? I will be a minute in relating all, but at what point shall the weird narrative begin? Una, at what point? Manos, you have said. Una, Manos, I comprehend you. In death we have both learned the propensity of man to define the undefinable. I will not say then commence with the moment of life cessation, but commence that sad an instant when the fever, having abandoned you and sank into the breathless and motionless torpor, and pressed down your pallid eyelids with the passionate fingers of love. Manos, my first word, my Una, in regard to man's general condition of this epoch, you remember that one or two of the wise among our forefathers, wise in fact that not in the world's esteem, had ventured to doubt the propriety of the term improvement as applied to the progress of our civilization. These were periods of each of the 5 of 6 centuries immediately preceding our dissolution, when arose some vigorous, intelligent, boldly contending to their principles, whose truth appears now to our disenfranchised reason so utterly obvious the principle should have taught our race to submit to the guidance of the natural laws rather than to attempt their control. The long intervals that some masterminds appeared, looking upon each advance in practical silence as the retrogression of the true utility, occasionally the poetic intellect, that intellect which we now feel to have been the most exalted of all, since those truths to which we were us of the most enduring importance could not only be reached by that analogy which speaks in proof tones to the imagination alone and to the unaided reason bears no weight. Occasionally did this poetic intellect proceed a step further in evolving the vague idea of the philosophic and find in the mystic parable of the tales of the tree of knowledge and of its forbidden fruit, death producing a distinct imitation of knowledge that not man met for man in the infant condition of his soul. And these men, the poets, living and perishing amid the scorn of the utilitarians, a rough pedants who arrogated to themselves the title which could have been properly applied only for the scorned. These men, the poets, pondered pinningly, yet not unwisely, upon the ancient days, which our wants were not more simple than our enjoyments have keen, days when mirth with the word unknown, so solemnly deep-toned was happiness, holy, august, and blissful days when blue rivers ran undammed down hills unhewn into the far forest solitudes, primeval, odious, and unexplored. Yet these noble exceptions from the general misrule serve but to strengthen it by opposition. Alas, we have fallen upon the most evil of our evil days. The great movement that was Kant termed went on, a deceased commotion, moral and physical. Art, the arts, arose supreme, and once enthroned, cast chains upon the intellect, which had elevated them no power. Man, because he has not but acknowledged the majesty of nature, fell into the childish exaltation of his acquired and still increasing dominion over her elements. Even while he stalked a god of his own fancy, the infantine imbecility came over him. As might he suppose from the origin of his disorder, he knew grew infected with system and with abstraction. He unwrapped himself in generalities. Among other odd ideas, that of universal quality gained ground, and in the face of analogy and of God, in despite of the loud warning voice of the laws of gradation, so visibly pervading all things on earth and heaven, while attempts of an omniprevalent democracy were made, yet this evil sprang necessarily from the leading evil knowledge. Man could not both know and succumb. Meantime, huge smoking cities arose, innumerable. Green leaves shrank before the hot breath of furnaces. Their fair face of nature was deformed with the ravages of some loathsome disease. And methinks sweet Una, even her slumbering sense of the forest and the far-fetched, might have arrested us here. But now it appears that we have worked out our destruction in the perversion of our taste, or rather in the blind neglect of the culture in the schools. For in truth, it was the crisis that taste alone, the faculty with which holding a middle position between the pure intellect and the moral sense, could never safely have been disregarded. It was now that taste alone could have led us gently back to beauty, nature, and to life. But alas, for the pure contemplative spirit and magistation into Plato, alas, for the which is justly regarded as an all-sufficient education of the soul. Alas for him and for it, since both we were desperately needed, when both were more entirely forgotten or despised. Pascal, a philosopher whom we both love, has said how truly it is not impossible that the sentiment of the natural, had time permitted it, would have regarded it an old ascendancy over the harsh mathematical reason of the schools, but these things would not be. Prematurely induced by the intemperance of knowledge, the old age of the world drew on. This is the mass of mankind saw not, or living lustily, although unhappily, affected not to see. But for myself, the earth's records have taught me to look for wildest ruin at the price of highest civilization. I have imbibed a prescience of our fate from comparison of China, the simple and enduring, with Assyria, the architect, with Egypt, the astrologer, with Nubia, more crafty than either, the turbulent mother of all arts. In the history of these regions, I met with the ray from the future. The individual artificialities of the three latter were local diseases of the earth, and their individual overthrows had been local remedies applied. But for the infected world at large, I could anticipate no regeneration save in death. The man, as the race could not become extinct, I saw that he must be born again. And now it was, fairest and dearest, that we wrapped our spirits daily in dreams. Now it was that in twilight we discoursed of the days to come, when the art-scarred surface of the earth had undergone the purification which alone could efface its rectangular obscenities, could clothe itself anew in the verdure and the mountain slopes and the smiling waters of paradise, to be rendered at length a fit dwelling place for man the death purge, for man who now exalted intellect, there could be poison in knowledge no more, for the redeemed regeneration, blissful and now immortal, but still the material man. Una, well, do you remember these conversations, dear Manos? But the epoch of the fiery overthrow was not so near at hand as we believed, but as the corruption you indicate did surely warrant us in believing men lived and died individually. You yourself sickened and passed into the grave, and whither your constant Una speedily followed you, and through the century which you had since elapsed, and whose conclusion brings us together once more, tortured our slumbering senses with no impatience of duration. Yet, my Manos, it was a century still. Manos, say rather a point of the vague infinity. Unquestionably, it was in earth's dotage that I died, worried at heart with anxieties which had their origin in the general turmoil and decay. I succumbed to their fierce fever. In some few days of pain and many of the dreamy delirium, replete with ecstasy, the manifestations of which you mistook for pain, which I longed but was impotent to undeceive you. After some days there came upon me, as you have said, a breathless and motionless torpor, and this was termed death by those who stood around me. Words are vague things. My condition did not deprive me of sentience. It appeared to me greatly dissimilar to the extreme quiescence of him who hath long slumbered long and profoundly, lying motionless and fully prostrate in the midsummer noon, begins to steal slowly back to its consciousness through merely sufficiently of his sleep and without being awakened by external disturbances. I breathed no longer. The pulses were still. The heart had ceased to beat. Volition had not departed, but was not powerless. The senses were unusually active, although eccentrically so, assumed each other's functions at random. The tastes and smells were inextricably confounded and became one sentiment, abnormal and intense. The rose water with which your tenderness had moistened my lips to the last affected me, and sweet fancies of flowers, fantastic flowers, far more lovely than any of the old earth, but whose prototypes have here blooming around us, the eyelids, transparent and bloodless, offered no complete independent of vision. The volition of the abeyance of the balls could not roll into their sockets, but all objects within the range of the visual hemisphere were seen with more or less distinctness. The rays fell upon the external retina and into the cornea of the eye, producing a more vivid effect than those which struck the front of the anterior surface. Yet in the former instance, this effect was far more anomalous than I appreciated only as sound. Sweet sound or discordant as the matters presented themselves at my side were light or dark in shade, curved or angular in outline. The hearing of the same time, although excited in degree, were not irregular in action, estimating real sounds with an extravagance of precision, no less than a sensibility. Touch had undergone a modification more peculiar. Its impressions were tardily received, but pertinaciously retained, and resulted always in the highest physical pleasure. Thus, the pressure of your sweet fingers upon my eyelids, at first only recognized through vision, at length, long after their removal, filled my only delight with essential delight immeasurable. I say with essential delight. All my perceptions are purely sensual. The materials furnished the passive brain of the senses were not in the least degree wrought into shape by the decreasing understanding. Of pain there was some little, of pleasure there was much, but of moral pain or pleasure none at all. Thus your wild sobs floated into my ear with all their mournful cadences, and were appreciated in their every variation of sad tone. But there were soft musical sounds, and no more. They conveyed in the extinct reason no imitation of their sorrows, which gave them birth, while the large and constant tears which fell upon my face, telling the bystanders of the heart which broke, thrilling every fiber of my frame with ecstasy alone. And this was the truth, the death of which these bystanders spoke reverently in low whispers. You, sweet Una, grasping with loud cries, they attired me for the coffin. 3 or 4 dark figures which flitted busily to and fro. As these crossed the direct line of my vision, they affected me as forms, but upon passing to my side, their images impressed me with the ideas of shrieks, groans, and other dismal expressions of terror, of horror, or of woe. You alone, habited in a white robe, passed in all directions musically about me. The day waned as its light faded away, and I became possessed by a vague uneasiness and an anxiety such as a sleeper feels when sad, real sounds fall continuously within his ear, low, distant bell tones, solemn as long but equal intervals and commingling with melancholy dreams. Night arrived, and with the shadow of heavy discomfort, it oppressed my limbs with the oppression of some dull weight, and was palatable. It was also a moaning sound, not unlike the distant reverberation of surf, with more continuous, which, beginning from the first twilight, had grown in strength with its darkness. Suddenly lights were brought into the room, and the reverberation became forthwith interrupted into frequent, unequal bursts of the same sound, but less dreary and less distinct. The ponderous oppression was in a great measure relieved, and the issuing from the flame of the lamp were flowered unbrokenly into my ears of a strain of melodious monotone. And then now, dear Una, approaching the bed upon which I lay outstretched, you sat gently by my side, breathing odor from your sweet lips and pressing them upon my brow, then arose tremendously within my bosom, mingling within the merely physical sensations which circumstances had called forth, a something akin to sentiment itself, a feeling that, half appreciating, half responded to your earnest love and sorrow, but this feeling took no root in the pulseless heart. It seemed indeed a rather shadow than a reality, and faded quickly away, first into extreme quiescence, and then into a purely sensual pleasure as before. And now, from the wreck and the chaos of the unusual senses, there appeared to have risen within me a sixth, all perfect. It is exercise I found a wild delight, yet a delight still physical, inasmuch as the understanding of it had no part. Motion in the animal frame had both fully ceased, no muscle quivered, no nerve thrilled, no artery throbbed, but there seemed to have sprung up in the brain that of which no words could convey in the merely human intelligence, even an indistinct conception. Let me term it in mental pendulous pulsation. It was a moral embodiment of man's abstract idea of time. It is an absolute equalization of this movement, or of such as this, had the cycles of the firmamental orbs themselves be adjusted, and it's a measure the irregularities of the clock upon the mantle and of the watches of the attendants. Their ticking came sonorously to my ears. The slightest deviation from the true proportion, and these deviations were omniprevalent, affected me just as violations of the abstract truth are wont on earth to affect the moral sense. Although no two of the timepieces in the chamber struck individual seconds accurately together, yet I had no difficulty in holding steadily in mind the tones and the respective monetary errors of each. And thus, this keen, perfect, self-existing sentiment of duration, this sentiment existing independently as of any succession of events, this idea, this sixth sense, upbringing from the ashes of the rest, was the first obvious and certainly steps of the temporal soul, and upon the threshold of the temporal eternity, it was midnight and still sat by my side. All others had departed from the chamber of death. They had despised me in the coffin, or deposited me in the coffin. The lamps burned flickeringly, and this I knew by the tumultuousness of the monotonous strains, but suddenly these strains diminished into distinctness and in volume. Finally, they ceased. The perfume in my nostrils died away. Forms affected my visions no longer. The impressions of the darkness uplifted itself into my bosom. A dull shock, that like of electricity, pervaded my frame and was followed by total loss of the idea of contract. All of that man was termed sense was merged into the sole consciousness of entity, and in the one abiding sentiment of duration, the mortal body had been at length stricken with the hand of the deadly decay. It had not all sentient departed, for the consciousness and the sentiment remained supplied from the functions of a lethargic intuition. I appreciated the direful change now in operation upon the flesh, and as the dreamer is sometimes aware of the bodily presence of who leans over him, so sweet Una, I still dutifully felt that as you sat by my side, so too when the noon of the second day came, I was not unconscious of those movements which displaced you from my side, which confined me within the coffin, which deposited me within the hearse, which bore me to the grave, which lowered me within it, which heaped me heavily, mold upon me, which thus lifted me in blackness and corruption and my sad and solemn slumbers within the worm. And here in the prison house, which have few secrets to disclose, there rolled away days and weeks and months, and the soul watched narrowly each second as it flew, and without effort took record of its flight, without effort and without object. The year passed, the consciousness of being had grown hourly more indistinct, and that of merely locality had in great measure usurped its position. The idea of entity had become merged in that of place. The narrow space immediately surrounded that had been the body. was now going to be the body itself, at length, as often happens to the sleepers, by sleep of the world alone in death imagined, at length, as sometimes happened on earth in the deep slumberer, when some fitting light half startled him into awakening, yet left him half enveloped in dreams, so to me in the strict embrace of the shadow that came, that light, that which alone might have had power to startle, the light of enduring love. Men toiled at the grave in which I lay darkling. They upthrew the damp earth. Upon my moldering bones they descended the coffin of Una, and now again all was void. The nebulous night had been extinguished. The feeble thrill had vibrated itself into quiescence. Many lustra had supervened. The dust had returned to dust. The worm had food no more. The sense of being had length utterly departed, and there reigned in its stead, instead of all things, dominant and perpetual, the autocrat's place and time. For that which was not, for that which had no form, for that which had no thought, for that which had no sentience, for that which was soulless, yet of which matter formed nor portion, for all these nothingness, yet of all the immortality, the grave was still a home, and the corrosive hours co-mates. Thus the end of the colloquy of Manos and Unas. If you think there's any truth and like and joining what I'm saying here, please like and subscribe and share, and have a nice day.